Okay.
All right. Hi, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar about learning how to set boundaries. My name is Lavanya Stevayanam, and I'm the social media coordinator for the clinic, and I will be attending the webinar alongside with you. With that being said, if you have any questions or comments along the way, please let us know, raise your hand. If you're watching the recorded version, please feel free to leave a comment down below or if you have a question. So today's presentation is hosted by the founder and clinic director, Cassandra Francis, who's also a registered psychotherapist. So let's welcome our host.
Hello. Thank you for the welcome. It's always nice to be introduced, as I usually do the introducing. So yes, as Lavanya mentioned, we will be speaking about learning how to set boundaries, and being boundariful is beautiful. I decided to go with this title because I know sometimes people say they have too many boundaries, and that's a good thing. Being boundariful is beautiful because you're more aware of self and your needs, right? But then some people, they need support with supporting boundaries. So we're here to talk about both perspectives. Again, as Lavanya mentioned, please feel free to engage throughout the presentation. And those that are watching the recorded version, feel free to engage in the comment section. So let's get into it. So today there is a full agenda, starting with discussion. Again, I love engagement, so please talk with me, talking about self-esteem just a little bit, as we do have another webinar on our YouTube channel breaking down more about what self-esteem means and how to build it, but we'll touch on it a little bit today, and of course talk about boundaries. And again, as Lavanya mentioned, if you have any questions, I put it as towards the end, but feel free to ask throughout in the comment section. Okay. So discussion time. So I'm curious to hear, where's everyone at with their boundaries? Like, what perspective are we coming from? I'm asking a lot of questions in one, but are you someone who knows how to set boundaries, but feel more self-conscious and having too many boundaries? Or are you someone who knows you have boundaries, but don't know how to set them, or you're completely just not aware of your boundaries? Where are we starting from?
I guess I could start to, get the conversation flowing. As someone who was raised in a very traditional, like South Asian home, as I barely was taught boundaries. It was more so give, and let people walk all over you. So growing out of that now, I see myself feeling bad for placing boundaries, almost like, oh my gosh, I didn't want to say no, but that's like, I feel bad for saying no. Like, no is a huge boundary. But I'm slowly starting to get the idea that having a boundary is good for you. So, yeah.
Yes, exactly. Thank you for sharing that, Lavanya.
No problem.
Absolutely, cultural influence can impede on your meaning of boundaries and when you set them and who you set them with, whether it's cultural in terms of your ethnicity or even familial culture too, right? Like, oh, we're family, so we're not going to have boundaries. It's hard to say that because I get the communal value, right, that people of color are typically raised by. But then there's the individual side of, having your independence and autonomy. Okay.
Hi, my name is Brooke. So I grew up as an only child, and my mom was very, here, whatever her view is, it's like, here, you have to think the same way. And I think I'm starting to learn I'm 45 years old. I'm starting to learn what my boundaries are, to recognize them. And it's just difficult learning how to set them. I think in the past, I've set them more by isolating myself, by being by myself. I can do whatever I want. I don't have to worry about that when I'm around people. I tend to be a bit more of a people pleaser. So I'm trying to find that space in between that.
Right. Thank you, Brooke. Thank you for joining us today, and thank you for sharing.
Thank you.
Yeah, go ahead. Were you
I
gonna
said
say
thank you for having us.
Oh, okay, absolutely. Yes, but absolutely the balance between the two, right? People pleasing is almost having little to no boundaries, and isolating is sure it's a boundary, but that's also extreme in itself because naturally we do want to connect with people, right? We do want to have attachments. Um, Isolation can feel safer, and that is a boundary, but if that's a lifestyle, then there is more space to learn how to develop your boundaries. So thank you. I hope everyone learns something today, and if you have any questions, again, always feel free to ask. So let me get more into it. So talking about self-esteem. So first and foremost, taking care of your health and safety is essential to your self-esteem. So prioritizing your well-being is a sign of self-love, and loving yourself is a bottom line requirement for building self-esteem, right? It is subjective. I was supposed to get more into it, but I'm like, please watch the video on self-esteem. But it is a subjective way that you view yourself, right? So sometimes when we are not catering to our self-esteem, it can impact how we set boundaries, right? Again, it's more likely to lead into people-pleasing tendencies or lead into having difficulties just standing up for yourself, right? And therefore, your emotional needs are not met, and then that trickles into how you feel about yourself, and the trickling, the snowball effect. So catering and being aware to your self-esteem in itself can help build your boundaries. And again, for ways to do that, please watch our video. Your level of self-esteem and the boundaries you set for yourself are very close related, right? So generally, the higher your self-esteem, the more well-defined your boundaries would be. But we are here to talk about boundaries specifically. So let's get a bit more into that. So what do boundaries mean? Essentially, a boundary is a personal property line that marks those things for which we are responsible for, right? Boundaries define who we are and who we are not. So of course, whether it's an actual line in the sand of like a physical boundary or a mental boundary, I will be breaking down the different types of boundaries shortly. But it does ultimately define who you are and who you are not. So boundaries are meant to be firm and not flexible or compromised. Again, compromising is a good communication technique and skill, but boundaries are there for a reason, right? They're a protector barrier in a certain way. There's a reason we feel the way we do, and we need to enforce our boundaries to honor our feelings, values, beliefs, and generally who we are as individuals. Right? They are typically interpersonal when it comes to work, but also intrapersonal when you're identifying or being more aware of your capacity. Boundaries differ from person to person and are mediated by variations in culture, as Lavanya and Brooke mentioned, personality and social context, right? Sometimes we might have a certain boundary with our coworkers, but not our friends or family, and vice versa. So boundaries are appropriate whenever your body tells you something is being crossed or violated or discomfort appears. Right? Setting boundaries defines our expectations of ourselves and others in different kinds of relationships. I feel like I said a lot there. So again, talk to me if you need to talk to me. So there are 7 types of boundaries. So again, this goes to the fact that when people feel like they have a lot of boundaries, then it makes sense because there are 7 general types. But this is also to say that some people might feel like they don't know how to set boundaries or they suck at setting boundaries. It's important to identify exactly what type of boundary is more challenging for you to set, because maybe you're excellent at setting a time boundary, but maybe conversational is a bit challenging, or emotional is a bit challenging. So I think that's also important to distinct and kind of compartmentalize in your mind of what type of boundary is easier for you to set, what type is more challenging for you to set, right? Because I think generalizing, I don't know how to set boundaries, I'm just, a people pleaser in relationships, that can chip away at your self-esteem, and also just, create that cycle of people pleasing behaviors, for example. But defining the 7 types a bit more. So mental is the freedom to have your own thoughts, values, and opinions, right? So an example is, I respect your perspective, although I do not agree. So really, mental, again, because it is about boundaries, it defines who you are and who you are not. So this is your world, right? Mental health, that's all your world. So you have your own perspective, and people can have their own. I think another good example of this is, I don't know if anyone has seen that meme where there's 2 people standing on each side of the number, and the number is, depending on perspective, it's either a 6 or a 9, right? So both are right in their own perspective, and there's really no wrong. So it's that boundary of, okay, this is my side, it's a 6, and this is my side, it's a 9. I hope people have seen that meme, so I'm not, not making sense. Another boundary is emotional. So this is how emotionally available you are to others. An example of this is, as much as I want to support you right now, I do not have the emotional capacity to do so. All right. So ultimately, since we're talking about mental health as well, it's, you are not your friend's therapist, and they're not your therapist, right? So it's so important to even set the boundary of asking someone that you want to talk to, assuming it's a friend or maybe coworker, family member, if they have the capacity to hear what you have to say. But it's also important to receive that check-in from someone else who might want to kind of downpour onto you, right? But emotional is very important to be honest. Well, all of them are important to be honest with, but emotional especially, in relationships, because that's the vulnerable side, right? So having boundaries and vulnerability is still crucial. Another example of a boundary is material. So this might be monetary decisions, giving or lending to others. So the example here is, I already lent you money last week, so I don't want to do it again, right? Money impacts a lot of relationships. So whether it is friends, families, lovers, coworkers, and maybe some people, again, are better at setting money or material boundaries, but the emotional might be a bit more challenging. So identify, as I go through this, what's your strengths, what's your challenges, and we'll talk more about how to build it. The 4th one is internal. So this states, this is about self-regulation, energy expanded onto self and versus others, right? So, and the example here is, I have been social all week and I need the weekend to myself, right? Yes, definitely I can resonate with this. Sometimes I love being social, but at the end of the day, I need my space, right? I need that moment to recharge. I find internal to be a combination of mental and emotional boundary, but to differentiate it a bit more, I would say mental is, of course, more about the mind. Emotions is emotions in itself. But internal is more about your body and your nervous system, and how much you have the capacity to hold space, right? Again, that energy recharge that comes from the body. Conversational. So this one is topics that you do and do not feel comfortable discussing. And the example to set would be, I would rather not be a part of this conversation, right? And then I find this more so at work. Typically with our friends and family, we're very colloquial and we could talk about various topics, although some could be, include boundaries. But typically at work, there's just some things we don't want to talk about, right? Whether it's your personal life as a whole or different parts of your personal life, like your love life or stressors, politics, religion, sexual orientation. These can be conversations that people feel uncomfortable with and would need to set those boundaries, right? Acknowledging that that too is a boundary. The sixth one is physical. So this is about your privacy, your personal space, and ultimately your body. So the example here is, I prefer to not hug people I do not know. I know this was peak during the pandemic of just not touching people you don't know, and sometimes even if you do know someone, it's, keeping your physical distance. But regardless, being aware of your physical boundaries is quite significant, even if you are comfortable with someone. And lastly, time. So this states, how much time you spend with someone or doing something. And the example is, I can only stay for 30 minutes. So with time, again, this can be whether you're at a family's home for the holidays and maybe they're not your favorite people. It's like, okay, I can only spend like an hour here max and gotta go. At work, we typically have our shifts of when we work until, and it's like, okay, this is my time for work. Outside of this, I'm done. So just being mindful of how you spend your time and what you're doing with it. And again, acknowledging the different parts of yourself to acknowledge, is this a capacity or not, right? Are you at capacity or not? Any questions?
Yes, I had a question.
Yes.
In terms of the 7 types, do you find that any are easier or harder to set? Like, for example, making an emotional boundary is a lot harder than a conversational boundary. Does it vary from person to person, or is it almost the same?
Yes, thank you. Thank you for that question. It definitely varies between person to person, as boundaries are about being individual, right? So again, they highlight who you are and who you are not. So some people, it might be easy to set an emotional boundary for their own reasons, but maybe setting a monetary boundary or material boundary is challenging, right? They can give externally, but internally it's like, okay, no, we're not going to go there. So it really does depend. I find, at least being a therapist, I typically hear about mental, emotional, internal, and physical. That just might be because of my perspective and the chair that I sit in, but it really does depend person to person. Which is why I think it's good to think about, okay, well, what is easier for you to set, and what is more challenging for you to set, and reflecting on how come one over the other. Okay. Well, what are healthy boundaries? Right. So there was already some examples on the wheel of what setting healthy boundaries looks like. But to define it, healthy boundaries define what is appropriate behavior in our relationships, and appropriate meaning behavior that keeps both parties safe. Right? So unhealthy can sometimes be considered isolation or disconnection when that is not the emotional requirement needed at that time, right? So again, sometimes we need that space to recharge, as that's an internal boundary. That could also be a physical boundary. But it becomes unhealthy when that becomes the more lifestyle, right? Okay, and setting healthy boundaries, again, is crucial for self-care, positive relationships, and ultimately, as though I'm saying positive relationships with others, also with yourself, right? They help us experience, and they as in healthy boundaries, help us experience less stress and anxiety, and again, just promoting self-respect and well-being. Ultimately catering to your needs. So, how to set boundaries? There are many ways, but I like this 3-step way, right? So, starting with being direct, clear, and straightforward. So, well, let me start with saying assertiveness is required in boundary setting, not aggressiveness, and definitely not passiveness. Assertiveness involves expressing your feelings openly and respectfully. So it does not entail making demands, but it requires people to listen to you. Right. So setting healthy boundaries requires you to assert your needs and priorities as a form of self-care. And here are the 3 steps. So being direct, clear, and straightforward as possible, right? Not needing to raise your voice, not needing to use swear words, but just being direct and clear, right? If you know, for example, maybe the emotional boundary, you don't have the capacity today. Someone's trying to talk to you, I don't have the capacity today, right? That is all direct, clear, straightforward. Step 2 is stating your need or request directly in terms of what you'd like rather than what you don't want or like, right? So for example, again, with emotional, let's say someone is trying to talk to you, they're in distress, maybe crisis mode, they're trying to talk to you. So say, I rather speak about this tomorrow. I rather speak about this on Saturday, right? Then say I don't want to speak right now, right? So sometimes shutting down again is, we do want to try and maintain relationships still. Boundaries doesn't have to be ending relationships. It shouldn't be ending relationships. But saying, I'd rather speak about this on another day rather than I'm not talking about this right now, sometimes someone can feel rejected, right? Which is okay. I mean, some people can respond how they're going to respond. But again, more as a tip of stating your need versus what you don't want. Step 3 would be accepting internal discomfort. So that's part of the boundaries that makes it hard is there is discomfort, right? Maybe there's guilt, maybe there's shame, maybe there's remorse. When setting boundaries, it's accepting that you are going to feel these emotions, but ultimately the greater good is providing yourself with your need, right? And also the person you're setting the boundaries with, if it is an interpersonal boundary, then they are aware of, okay, this is what you prefer, and then it's their decision if they're going to respect that or not, right? And at that time too, it's also your decision if you want to maintain the relationship or not. So across the board, setting boundaries makes things very clear, but accepting the emotions is also part of that journey. So I've noticed that sometimes adults that have been raised by childhood, like guardians or parents, when sorry, I'm tripping all over my words. But so when their parents have taught them that expressing their needs is bad and selfish, sometimes as adults, this can make setting boundaries hard, right? Because their needs were more dismissed and encouraged to be met. However, not accepting the discomfort that comes from setting healthy boundaries in adulthood can lead to more unhealthy relationships and can also lead to resentment, manipulation, and abuse. So just continuing. So 4 tips. So those were the general 4 steps, but 4 tips when setting the boundaries is, of course, defining it, right? So what are you setting, right? What is part of the 7 categories? Which boundary are you exercising, right? And define exactly what it is, and not necessarily, this is, well, maybe you need to actually. I was about to say, we're not necessarily saying, well, this is an emotional boundary, and it is, you would need to define within yourself what boundary is being crossed, and therefore being able to communicate it the way you need to someone else would be beneficial. Communication. So there are various types of communication. There's indirect, there's direct. And again, a step to setting boundaries is using direct communication, right? Communicating what you need. I think that's self-explanatory. It's all about communication. Sometimes I'm just thinking about nonverbal, right? Which is using your hands, maybe using your head or your body language. That can also be perceived as direct depending on the context, right? So putting words to saying no is not always needed than just shaking your head no, right? That you're still setting a boundary even if you're not using a word, but ultimately communicating what you need. The third step is stay simple. So not needing to over-explain where you don't need to. Again, if it comes to, let's say, material boundary, right? Maybe someone wants to borrow something from you, and it's something that you value and you treasure. Simply saying, I don't feel comfortable sharing that, right? That's it. I think when people sometimes get into their head of like, you need to explain why, and go through all the hurdles and the mental gymnastics, it can make setting boundaries already more tedious and exhausting than it would need to be. Of course, depending on who you're setting boundaries with, you might know there might be a rebuttal, but ultimately keeping it simple gives less space for a rebuttal in a certain way, right? I think, Brooke, you had your hands up.
Yes, I want to touch on that. And you said with certain people, there might be rebuttal, or like when you're dealing with someone who is constantly like wanting you to explain everything and like needing that explanation for everything. And I think sometimes for myself, it's hard because I might get a feeling and know something I don't want to do, but I can't even like kind of communicate it fully or completely define it for myself. So it's then really hard to do that to somebody else. And then even when I do know it, like just how do you sort of within the boundary, or do you set a boundary around, hey, when I set a boundary, I don't have to explain it, or like, do you know what I mean?
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. And exactly with what you ended with, right? When I set a boundary, I don't want to have to explain it, right? Or this is my boundary. I don't need to over explain it. Because actually that's my 4th tip, right? Is kind of setting the consequences of when you're setting a boundary and someone might, be giving you the back and forth. Maybe the consequence is I'm not going to have the back and forth with you, or I'm going to leave, right? So letting them know that you're being firm, you're being assertive, right? You're exercising your self-care by setting this boundary. I think ultimately, again, this is assuming it's not family. Sometimes family is a bit more challenging to let go of than a coworker, right? But if you're noticing your boundaries are continuously being violated by this person, then how much do you want to surround yourself with this person, right? How much do you want them in your life? Or maybe you need support with setting boundaries with them. So I think ultimately, if someone is giving you the back and forth, it is also your choice whether you want to engage in the back and forth, but setting consequences for that interaction can also be beneficial. I hope that answered your question, Brooke.
Kind of, but yes.
Kind of. Well, let me
I
know.
see more of like in a relationship, which definitely, I guess, at the end of the day, you do have the choice to leave the relationship, but sometimes it's not quite that simple.
Right.
But it's
Yes.
just,
Yes.
Can you talk? Are you gonna talk a little bit more about the consequences, about how setting consequences, like how?
Yes.
Are you going to talk a little bit more about consequences?
Yes, I can expand on it. Initially, I was going
Thank
to
you.
give the tips as is, but I could definitely expand on setting consequences. So again, because boundaries are context dependent, I'm just trying to think of an example, unless you have an example you want to give me and I can walk through that scenario.
I can't really think of an example, but I know, like, so just in the past number of years, I've learned, like, with my daughter at school, they have like natural consequences versus, like, like when you're disciplining kids, it's like, oh, instead of like something that's, directly related. Should it be somewhat like that? Or
It truly, it's a subjective experience, right? So when setting boundaries, it's all about you and your comfort level and your how you feel safe, right? So there's no necessarily right or wrong consequence to give someone. It just depends on the context to which you feel your boundaries being violated, right? So let's say, well, actually, before I continue, I noticed Lisa put up your hand. Are you responding to this, or do you have another question?
I'm responding to this because actually, and thank you for putting on this webinar, because I actually have been criticized a lot in my past about my lack of being able to set boundaries by people close to me. And I think that I've been good at it in some regard and not so good in definitely in others. But before Brooke posed a question, I actually had a question about that, because I was thinking about how much communication has to be involved in explaining yourself when you're setting a boundary. I know I tend to over-explain a lot, and that's basically because of some historical things that have happened in my early life, where I felt the need to have to over-explain a boundary that I'm setting for myself, because I felt violated in setting a boundary or an expectation of a boundary. So my first question was like, Brooks, like, how much explaining do you have to do? But at the same time, going to the consequences, I've learned, and I just wanted to give this tip as an example, that I've had to learn how to set certain boundaries with my adult children. So, for example, they know they can call me anytime, and they do call me anytime. And then they never ask, there's a point where they never ask if I'm prepared for this information, I'm prepared for this conversation. It's just, Mom, talk to me now, right? And I've learned recently that I have to say sometimes, okay, if we're talking about these things, or if this thing is going to happen during the conversation, or that thing's going to happen in the conversation where I feel uncomfortable or becomes disrespectful in any way, I'm going to hang up the phone.
Right.
And that was the boundary that I set. But of course, that with my children is a little different than that with, like, say, a coworker, like,
Right.
or my boss. Like, I couldn't say, well, maybe I could. And I actually, to be honest with you, I have done that too with a boss. But anyhow, I've learned to just, as a consequence of my boundary that I've set in advance, that of, because we've articulated it multiple times, if you violate this particular boundary, I'm going to hang up the phone. I'm going to walk away from this conversation. And I declare it, I say it just in a simple sentence. I don't over-explain why I'm walking away, where I'm going, what I'm going to do after I walk away.
Right.
Just,
Right.
this is what I'm going to do.
Right.
And this is what's going to happen. It's happened where I've had, okay, you did this thing, I'm going to hang up the phone. I don't even say it, I just hang up the phone, because I've already articulated myself. Right. So I'm offering that as an example. I don't know if that's an extreme version of setting a consequence, but
no,
an example.
No, thank you. Thank you so much, Lisa. Thank you. Definitely not extreme at all, right? You were simple in your statement of if you become disrespectful or if maybe you become triggered in the conversation or you don't have the capacity, you would need to hang up. And that is the consequence, right? You already forewarned them. So what happens during the conversation, what happens after, it should then be, everyone knows each other's expectations, right? So that's an example of a consequence, Brooke, is what you feel you are no longer going to tolerate. So maybe in a relationship, an intimate relationship, it's not, okay, I'm going to end this with you, or maybe it's okay, if we don't have this conversation right now, then I can't go away this weekend with you, or if we don't have this conversation, then I'm not ready to start planning a vacation with you, right? So that it's, consequences don't have to necessarily be endings, but they do have to be something that you do fulfill, right? So with Lisa's example of, I'll hang up, I'm going to hang up the phone if this is something, this conversation is something I can't tolerate, then actually hang up the phone when it becomes something you can't tolerate, right? Not only is it, again, going to set the boundary and be firm so the other person knows you're serious, right? And to not do it again, hopefully. It also will feel good, right? Because now you're exercising your boundary and what you said you're going to do, you've done. And that does cater to building up your self-esteem, right? So the more you honor your boundaries, the more it does cater to building your self-esteem, and the more it does become more natural in doing it, right? And the more you feel that the flow and the natural of, okay, right, I feel secure in myself. And if someone disrupts this security that I feel I've solidified, then that becomes more clearer on what the consequence would be for you in that situation. Right? Does that make sense? Or any more comments, not even questions?
I can actually concur and attest to that, feeling good about setting that boundary and following through, because although it might feel, a little bit, there's a little tiny bit of guilt when you do something extreme, like you end something or you hang up the phone or you do but I actually did feel better. And I actually did feel a little bit more boosted in my self-esteem because I felt like, okay, this time I did not let somebody walk over me, right, like I would have done in the past. And so when you said that, I kind of nodding my head like, yes, I agree with that. It does actually boost you. Even if you feel a little bit of a way about it, because naturally we're not trying to be mean, but we're trying to protect our mental health and our well-being at the same time. Because if we're not okay in the moment to carry out this particular conversation or this line of interaction, then what's the point? Like, none of us are going to feel good in the end, right? So let's both take a step back, gather our perspectives, get back together again, and complete the interaction. And I think that is just a really good way of setting a boundary, fulfilling a consequence, if that boundary is not followed through with, and then gathering yourself to come back again and start over.
Right. Yes, and especially in relationships, right, with children, with lovers. Most often than not, we don't want to end those relationships, definitely, right? We want them to be healthy, and to have healthy relationships, you do require healthy boundaries. There's no way around that. And as you said, Lisa, too, accepting that there will be discomfort, right? Whether it's the general discomfort, guilt, remorse, shame, accepting that might be part of it, but ultimately you will feel better. And that's the bigger picture. Your boundaries are being violated. You already don't feel good. You want to feel better. Brooke, you raised your hand.
So speaking to that, like discomfort, that internal discomfort, like, because it does definitely feel good to like set that boundary and to take care of ourselves. And then I think that for me, there's two parts to that discomfort. I guess one is one is internal,
Okay.
where it's like here feeling a little guilty about it, but it's more that external, like the other person, right? Seeing the pain that's causing them. How do we help support like other people in accepting our boundaries? Does that make sense?
Oh, that does, but I'm going to shut that down immediately because that's not your responsibility.
So, I mean, to a certain extent, I agree. I mean, is there, and it isn't like, okay, if it's a coworker at work, it isn't. If it's a stranger on the street, it isn't. But if it's our children, if it's our lovers, if it's our parents, to a certain extent, if this is a relationship that either we can't distract ourselves from because it's familial, or that we don't want to because it's a lover, it's like, I guess maybe part of it's like, hey, saying here, you go learn about boundaries yourself so you can accept them, or like, hey, here, this is maybe work that you need to do within your, but like how. Because I mean, at the end of the day, otherwise it does, if they're never going to accept them or they keep pushing back, then it comes to this point where you have to kind of let it go. So it's like kind of getting them on the same page.
Right.
But still setting that concrete boundary, but saying maybe here, this is what you can go do to kind of help get yourself there as well, or something. I don't know.
Well, okay, yes, you're saying a few things. One of them, which is what I shut down, is we cannot control how someone receives our boundary, right? If you're going to set a boundary and you've been direct, you've been clear, you've been straightforward, you kept it simple, you stated the consequence, you know, you're doing all the things that you need to do for yourself. How they receive it has very little to do with how you communicated if you've already done all you could do, right? Of course, in understanding that's why it's important to be direct and be straightforward, right? And firm in that way. So if you're setting a boundary and maybe you're unsure of what you feel, then it will probably come across in your tone, and therefore it might be confusing for the other person to understand, and therefore maybe respect, right? So there might be some pushback or more conversation needed for clarity of, okay, what exactly do you need, right? But when setting, ideally, you know, developing that communication of what you're trying to say and what the need is, also developing that self-assurance of this is a need for you, and it must be said. You can only be as clear as you can be, right? For example, even if it's a no, if the person is like, okay, well, what do you mean, right? No means no. No means I don't want to do this. I don't feel like doing this. I don't want to engage with this. It's a no. If they're choosing to not understand, at that point, yeah, I did use the exact words there. They're choosing to not understand, right? If you're being as clear as you can possibly be in a given context, and they're not understanding you, there's only so much I could even suggest and give tips on how to deal with that situation. I think it's definitely something to reflect on of you know, what is being triggered exactly, and in that way, how come it's difficult for the person to respect what you're saying, right? Maybe it's not if they understand what you mean, because in many languages, no is no, right? But if they're not respecting it, then that's a different level to reflect on of who you're surrounded by, right? Boundaries are more challenging when you're in terms of self, right? When you're not familiar with setting them or putting words to them, that is the more challenging part that I would encourage clients to focus on, right? I always tell clients actually to not focus on what the person would say or their reaction, but focus on what you want to say, right? Because again, that is typically what comes up. trying to focus on, okay, so but they might say this, so then I have to say this, or they might not listen, or they might not respect it, or they might not understand, like that. There's so much hypotheticals and unknowns that can come from that scenario, but focusing on overcoming your challenge of, okay, what is my boundary? What part is this coming from? What needs to be done in this particular situation? And then proceeding, right? But as Lisa also said too, which is a good boundary, is maybe you're not ready to have that conversation with the person, right? If both of you might be a bit more emotionally dysregulated, then maybe it's not a time to have understanding in that moment. Maybe you do need to take space and figure out, okay, what is going on for you? And then being able to communicate that to them, right? If you're constantly feeling misunderstood and not heard and not seen by someone you're with, then that's a whole other conversation than just boundary setting. Yeah. I just ended with curiosity of what other people have to say. But also, I know this is more of a webinar type podcast vibe, but it's turned into great discussions, great discussions. And if you are curious of engaging in psychotherapy, Brooke, or any of the viewers at all, please feel free to reach out to One Piece Therapy and our administrator, and we can support you with developing your boundaries in relationships or your boundaries with self, right? Yeah. Okay. I don't know if I answered everything, but I feel like I said a lot. So naturally, it was good timing of everyone bringing in their questions. But is there any more questions or comments? Yeah, even with what I explained, if there's anything that's standing out to you, I'm more than happy to hear.
I have a comment just around the entire presentation itself. Is I actually learned some things, because when I was thinking about boundaries, I was thinking about it in many of the contexts that you presented it in, but there were a lot of other things that as you were talking, I started to reflect and started to think and started to conceptualize, okay, what will I do better next time? What worked for me in the past? So it was really good grounding for me to have this session. And just in general, I had to set a boundary to get into this webinar.
Yes, absolutely.
Because I had just came out of a meeting. I had 4.5 minutes to decompress from that. It was a heavy meeting. And I had 4.5 minutes to decompress. I almost said to myself, no, I'm not gonna, I need to get back to work. I need to get on this thing. And I sat there in the 4.5 minutes and held a small meditation, said, I'm gonna set a boundary for myself to get into this meeting to learn more about setting boundaries.
Yes.
So I really appreciate the timing. It's always Kesmet. I appreciate the information that you provided, the way that you articulated it, the way that you respond to the questions themselves. So thank you for what you've done here today. Appreciate it.
Yes, thank you. I feel like applauding you for setting boundaries and then sticking to it. But thank you so much, Lisa, for attending this webinar. That is a great example. Time, right? As I mentioned, it is part of the 7 general boundaries. Even in that, I don't know how your mentality started before getting in terms of where you felt you were at with your boundary setting, but you were able to set time, right? And then have that boundary. So I think, again, it's just so important that we identify our strengths and weaknesses, right? So not only do we understand ourselves better, but we can communicate that better to other people. But also just naturally helps you build your self-esteem. Like, okay, I'm good with time. Maybe emotional needs some work, but I'm good with time. Like you can feel good about that. And again, that helps just build their relationship with yourself. But yes, there was a lot to reflect on today, and I appreciate everyone for their attendance, for their presence, for their comments, questions. Again, if you are interested in continuing this conversation and maybe seeking a therapist, I do have our information up here. And it is One Piece Therapy on all social media platforms. We have Instagram, Facebook, YouTube, TikTok, and LinkedIn. So again, please feel free to continue this conversation with us, but definitely continue that conversation with yourself, right? I'm still thinking about Brooke's question, just in terms of, what if someone doesn't understand me, and I guess supporting their understanding. Something, again, what you can do is just take time to reflect on how are you communicating, and then knowing that there is a line between how much you can put out and how much someone can receive. But continuously not feeling understood is a whole other conversation. But thank you. Thank you, everyone, for attending. If you have any more questions, comments, please feel free to ask. But otherwise, we're done for today.